On a heavy, humid night in August of 1851, somewhere deep within the tobacco fields of Southside, Virginia, a slave trader's ledger recorded a peculiar entry that history would never fully explain. The words written in that fading ink read, "One specimen, age approximately 19, purchased from Charleston Market, unique physical characteristics. Price $2.8470, nearly 4 times the standard rate." The buyer's name, Thomas Rutledge, owner of the sprawling Belmont estate. What unfolded in the 14 months that followed would end with 3 mysterious deaths, the total abandonment of a once thriving plantation, and the deliberate destruction of every document connected to that cursed property. Court records from Prince Edward County later revealed that by November of 1852, the estate had been sold at auction for only a fraction of its worth, with a peculiar stipulation that certain rooms within the mansion remained sealed forever. Local historians would later uncover 17 separate mentions of what they called the Rutledge incident in letters and private journals from that time, yet every official record had been wiped from existence. The few surviving accounts all spoke of one thing, an obsession so deep, so consuming, that it destroyed everything it touched. And that obsession began with a single enslaved person whose very existence defied the understanding of that era. Before we continue with the haunting story of Belmont Estate and the mysterious purchase that sealed the Rutledge family's fate, if tales from the darkest corners of American history fascinate you, the ones they tried to erase, make sure you're subscribed to The Dark Truth. Tap that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss stories like this. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's uncover what truly happened behind the locked doors of Belmont Estate, and why 3 people would die trying to keep it buried. The truth of that autumn is far more disturbing than any ghost story ever told. In 1851, Southside Virginia was its own isolated world, a landscape stitched together by vast tobacco plantations divided by dense woods of oak and pine, with dirt roads that turned to thick red clay whenever the autumn rains came. This was the heart of tobacco country, where wealth was measured in acres and human lives. The air itself was heavy, humid, and always tinged with the sharp, bitter scent of curing tobacco. Belmont Estate stood on the eastern edge of Prince Edward County, a 30,000-acre property that had belonged to the Rutledge family since 1783. The mansion was built in classic Georgian style, red brick walls, tall white columns, black shutters, grand yet restrained, the kind of wealth that preferred quiet pride over loud display. Behind the house stretched a double row of slave cabins, forming a small village of the 42 enslaved people who worked the fields and household. That summer, Thomas Rutledge was 37, tall, disciplined, and shaped by generations of Virginia's elite. He had inherited Belmont 7 years earlier, along with the debts his father left behind, and had spent every day since trying to restore the family fortune. He was known to be strict but not unusually cruel, a man who treated his enslaved workers with cold precision rather than kindness. His wife, Catherine, was 10 years younger, a delicate, porcelain beauty from Richmond, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who made his money through shipping. Her dowry had rescued the plantation's finances, but her marriage had not rescued her. 2 years earlier, she had delivered a stillborn son, and since that day, something in her spirit had dimmed. She spent her days alone in the upstairs sitting room, lost between novels and the empty fields beyond the window. To the outside world, the Rutledges were everything a plantation family should be: respectable, orderly, polished. They attended Christ Church in Farmville, hosted dinners for neighboring landowners, and upheld the social rituals that defined Virginia's planter class. Thomas sat on the county board, Catherine led charitable societies and supervised the household staff with distant civility. Yet beneath that polished surface, both husband and wife were hollowed by a quiet misery they couldn't name. Thomas felt an emptiness no amount of success could fill. Catherine felt invisible, fading from herself day by day. They lived together, yet apart, 2 ghosts haunting the same house. It was into that quiet despair that Samuel Wickham, a slave trader, arrived on the morning of August 14, 1851. Wickham was a wiry man with a pointed face and eyes that missed nothing. His black suit was well worn, his manners sharp, his trade darker than either. He specialized in special acquisitions, enslaved people with unique skills or unusual traits that fetched high prices from collectors and curious men of science. For 6 months he had been traveling along the coast, Baltimore, Charleston, Savannah, searching for merchandise that would intrigue his richest clients. Thomas received him in his plantation office, a small brick building apart from the main house, used for business matters he preferred to keep private. Wickham accepted a glass of whiskey, spoke idly about the tobacco market, and mentioned the rising political tension over slavery and new territories, the kind of talk all planters avoided but could never escape. Then, lowering his voice, Wickham leaned in. "I've come into possession of something extraordinary, Mr. Rutledge," he said smoothly. "Something that may appeal to a man of your particular intellect." Thomas frowned. "I'm not seeking new field hands at the moment." "This isn't a field hand," Wickham interrupted, slipping a folded document from his coat, a bill of sale covered with notes. "This is a unique specimen, purchased 3 weeks ago from the Charleston market. Formerly owned by a physician, Dr. Albert Strad, who obtained the slave from an estate in New Orleans. Raised in a household, educated, literate, but that's not what makes it remarkable." He paused, gauging Thomas's reaction before continuing. "This individual," he said softly, "is what the medical men call a hermaphrodite, possessing both male and female characteristics. Perfectly formed in both aspects. Dr. Strad documented the condition extensively before his death. The specimen is young, 19, maybe 20, healthy and entirely compliant. Trained from childhood for examination and obedience." Wickham smiled faintly. "I'm asking $2,847, well above market price. But consider what you're truly buying, Mr. Rutledge. This is not labor. This is a phenomenon." Thomas felt a strange unease twist inside him. Both male and female. Neither one nor the other. A living contradiction. He thought of Catherine, staring out her window like a spirit trapped in daylight. He thought of his own emptiness, his private ache for meaning. "I'll need to see the slave first," he said. "Of course," Wickham replied, rising with a knowing smile. "I have the wagon outside." 20 minutes later, Thomas stood in that same office, face to face with Jordan for the first time. The slave stood silently in the doorway, eyes lowered, hands clasped, the posture of submission learned by all who had been born into bondage. Dressed in a plain cotton shift, Jordan revealed little, yet even at a glance, Thomas understood what Wickham had meant. The beauty was uncanny, almost unreal, a face of delicate symmetry, neither masculine nor feminine, with high cheekbones, full lips, and dark eyes that seemed to hold something ancient. The short-cropped black hair framed that impossible face, and the body beneath the cloth was both graceful and unreadable, curves and lines belonging to no single form. When Wickham ordered Jordan to speak, the voice that came out defied every expectation, a tone balanced precisely between male and female, soft yet firm, like two melodies blended into one. "My name is Jordan, master," the slave said evenly. "I am 19 years old. I can read, write, and cipher. I have been trained to submit to medical examination without resistance. I am obedient and willing to serve." The words were memorized, mechanical, but beneath them, Thomas heard something else, an intelligence, a quiet awareness that this person knew exactly what they were, and what they were being sold for. He felt an unsettling fascination bloom inside him, not desire, not fear, but the pull of a mystery his mind could not let go. "I'll take it," he said finally. Within the hour, the transaction was done. Wickham left, pleased with his sale, while Thomas remained standing in the office, alone with Jordan, and with a feeling that something had shifted in the air around him. "Come," he said at last. "I'll decide where you'll stay." He did not take Jordan to the slave quarters behind the main house. Instead, he led the figure to a small cottage near the garden, a house once meant for his father's valet, long unused. Secluded, private, yet close enough for convenience. "You'll stay here," Thomas said. "I'll send for you when I decide your duties." "Yes, "Master," Jordan replied, expression blank, voice calm. That evening, over dinner, Thomas mentioned the new purchase to Catherine, choosing his words carefully. He described Jordan as an unusually educated house slave, someone with a medical background, perhaps useful to the household. Catherine barely reacted, distracted and distant. "If you think it's necessary," she murmured. "The slave has uncommon characteristics," Thomas added quietly. "The previous owner was a physician. It might prove instructive." Something in his tone made Catherine look up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of characteristics?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "It's difficult to explain. You should see for yourself." The next morning, he took her to the cottage. Catherine stepped inside with polite indifference, until she saw Jordan. Her expression changed. That indifferent gaze sharpened, drawn to the strange symmetry, the unplaceable beauty, the unsettling grace that defied all categories. "This is Jordan," Thomas said, watching her carefully. Catherine circled the slave slowly, her face unreadable. Jordan stood motionless, eyes lowered, breath steady. "What exactly makes this one so unusual?" she asked quietly. Thomas explained, measured, clinical, repeating what Wickham had told him. As his words unfolded, he saw that same flicker of fascination in Catherine's eyes, the same troubled curiosity that had seized him. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time, then she reached out, her hand trembling slightly, hovering near Jordan's face before falling back to her side as if afraid to bridge the impossible distance between them. May I examine for myself, to understand?" she asked, her voice soft, uncertain. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken, a strange mix of anticipation and dread twisting in his chest. "If you wish," he murmured, the words leaving his mouth before he fully understood what he was permitting. What took place in that cottage over the next hour would mark the true beginning of their descent, a quiet, irreversible shift in the order of their lives. Catherine's initial examination began with the detached precision of scientific curiosity, her questions framed in the calm tone of inquiry. She studied Jordan's face, traced the delicate structure of the slave's hands, and asked about Dr. Strahd's documentation with a scholar's fascination. Yet gradually, imperceptibly, her composure softened. What had begun as analysis became something wordless, something neither Thomas nor Catherine could have named, but both instantly recognized when they saw it reflected in each other's eyes. When they finally left that cottage and returned to the main house, they spoke not a word of what had passed between them. But that night, for the first time in months, they came together in their bed, not from affection, not from longing, but from a dark, shared secret that bound them in silence. What joined them was not love, but fascination, a dangerous curiosity about the impossible being who now lived beyond their garden walls. It was the birth of an obsession that would consume them both. The autumn of 1851 crept over Prince Edward County with the scent of drying tobacco and the first hints of cold, but inside Belmont Estate, something far less natural was taking root. Within a week of Jordan's arrival, a new rhythm emerged, one that every enslaved soul on the property noticed, even if none dared to speak of it aloud. Jordan was moved from the garden cottage to a small chamber on the third floor of the main house, officially named Catherine's personal maid. The slave was dressed in finer garments, given better food, and set apart from the others, existing in a liminal space of privilege and isolation that no one could quite understand. But the others saw the changes, and what they saw unsettled them deeply. They noticed how the master and mistress would vanish upstairs at odd hours, how strange sounds filtered through the walls, sounds too human to be explained and too private to be ignored. They noticed how Jordan would descend those narrow stairs afterward, moving carefully, as though each step carried invisible weight, face blank, eyes distant. Harriet, the plantation's cook, was the first to sense the true danger beneath the surface. She had worked at Belmont for 20 years, surviving 3 generations of Ruttalds, and had learned to read danger the way others read scripture. She saw how Thomas neglected the plantation, bills piling up on his desk, meetings forgotten, fields left untended. She saw how Catherine grew paler, thinner, her appetite fading along with her light. Most of all, she saw how both of them seemed to orbit around that third-floor room as if it were the center of their world. One morning in late September, Harriet found Jordan in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the master and mistress. The younger slave's movements were precise, deliberate, almost mechanical. "Child," Harriet whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "are they hurting you up there? You can tell me. I been here long enough to know when something ain't right." Jordan lifted those strange, calm eyes. "I have everything I need, Aunt Harriet. The master and mistress treat me well." Harriet frowned. "That ain't what I asked." For a fleeting second, something flickered across Jordan's face, pain, or resignation, gone before it could be named. "I do what I was born to do," Jordan said softly. "What I was trained to do. It's easier when you don't think about it." That night, whispers rippled through the quarters. The others spoke of the strange new slave who never joined them at dusk, who never came to the woods for secret prayers, who lived apart from them yet under the same roof as the white masters. Some remembered old stories, conjure, hoodoo, spirits that took human form to test the wicked. Others dismissed it as fear, though none could explain what was happening in the great house. Meanwhile, on the third floor, Thomas and Catherine were discovering new depths of their obsession. Thomas began to drown in books of anatomy and medical curiosities, scouring their pages for answers that might make sense of Jordan's existence. He filled a private journal with sketches and notes, entries written in a feverish hand, hidden from everyone, even Catherine. She, on the other hand, turned her curiosity into ritual. She spent entire afternoons with Jordan, having the slave dress and undress, experimenting with hairstyles, fabrics, silhouettes, trying to capture, or perhaps control, the enigma that stood before her. She ordered new garments from Farmville, some cut for men, some for women, some that belonged to neither world. "I want to understand what you are," she confessed one afternoon, eyes wide with trembling intensity. "Whether you're both or neither, or something else entirely." Jordan stood motionless, voice low and even. "Does it matter, mistress? I am what you see, what you wish to see." "But what do you see when you look at yourself?" For the first time, Catherine's composure faltered. "I see what everyone has always seen," Jordan continued quietly, "something to be examined. Something to be understood. Something that exists only for the curiosity of others." Catherine's hand froze mid-motion. "That's not," but she couldn't finish, because both of them knew it was. By the time September bled into October, Belmont appeared unchanged from the outside, but rot had already set in. Thomas moved like an automaton through his duties, managing the plantation with hollow efficiency when he bothered at all. Catherine declined social invitations, retreating deeper into herself. The enslaved people kept to their tasks, whispering among themselves but careful not to invite punishment through questions. Still, the decay was visible. Thomas had grown gaunt, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness, his movements restless and erratic. Catherine had withered into something ghostly, her once beautiful gowns replaced by dark, shapeless dresses, her hair unkempt, her voice distant. And Jordan, unchanged, unreadable, gliding through the house like a spirit trapped between worlds, neither living nor dead, neither servant nor master, but something else entirely. Late in October, the first open fracture appeared. Two brothers, Samuel and Isaac, attempted to flee the plantation, only to be captured 15 miles away. Brought back in chains, they were whipped under Thomas's orders. He watched the punishment with dull eyes, as though the act belonged to someone else. When the yard was empty, he lingered by the post, face hollow, the whip still echoing in his mind. Harriet watched him from the kitchen window and understood, the master was not simply obsessed, he was unraveling. That night, she heard raised voices from the third-floor room, Thomas and Catherine arguing, their tones sharp and desperate. The next morning, Jordan came for breakfast, moving with slow, deliberate care, eyes hollow. Harriet looked into them and saw a terrible certainty, the knowledge of how this story would end. November came with bitter winds that stripped the fields bare, and the cold that settled inside Belmont was not of the weather. The plantation was quietly dying. Fields went unplanted, fences unrepaired, debts ignored. Thomas stopped visiting town, stopped attending church or board meetings. His peers whispered excuses, illness, grief, financial troubles, never guessing the real truth because it was unthinkable. Catherine no longer tried to appear in public. She moved through the house like a shadow, sometimes wandering the garden in her nightdress, sometimes staring for hours at the horizon. Her friends stopped calling, the minister visited once, left troubled, and did not return. The enslaved people, wiser than the whites they served, knew something dark had broken inside the house. Their masters had crossed a line no one could name. The plantation functioned only because the enslaved people kept it moving, driven by survival rather than orders, and Jordan remained in the center of it all, feared at first, then pitied. Some of the women, out of quiet compassion, tried to reach out. Delia, once Catherine's maid, spoke gently as they passed in the corridor. "If you need anything, if you ever want to talk, just know you're not alone." Jordan's eyes met hers briefly. "Thank you. But I am alone. We all are, in the end." The words carried no sadness, only truth. By late November, Thomas had withdrawn even from Jordan, his fascination curdled into despair. Nights found him in his study, staring at the locked journal he no longer dared to open. Catherine filled the void, visiting Jordan daily, talking endlessly about her lost child, her failed womanhood, her hollow marriage. Jordan listened with the patience of someone who had long ago stopped believing in rescue. "Why do you stay?" Catherine asked one afternoon. "You could run." Jordan's reply was calm, almost tender. "And go where, mistress?" "Wherever I go, people will see what I am and want to own it. At least here, I know the shape of my cage." Catherine whispered, "That's terrible." "Yes, mistress," Jordan said, "it is." It was during one of those long, feverish afternoons that Catherine asked, "Do you hate us?" Jordan was silent for a long moment. "Hate requires freedom," came the answer at last. "To hate you, I would have to believe I deserve something different. That I have a right to be human. But I was taught otherwise. I am studied, not seen. Desired, not known. So no, mistress. I don't hate you. I simply endure you." Catherine began to cry, the kind of crying that shakes something primal loose. Jordan didn't move, simply watched, as though bearing witness was all that remained. When Catherine finally spoke again, her voice was small. "We're destroying ourselves," she whispered. "This, Thomas and I, this obsession with you, it's like a disease." "Yes, mistress," Jordan said. "And you're just watching? What else can I do?" The final unraveling began on December 15th, when Dr. Edmund Carlyle arrived at Belmont Estate. A physician from Richmond, a man of reputation and arrogance, Carlyle had written weeks earlier, offering his condolences for Thomas's supposed troubles. In desperation, Thomas had replied, mentioning Jordan as a medical curiosity and inviting him to examine the case. When the doctor arrived that gray afternoon, a stout man in his 60s with white mutton chops and the self-importance of authority, Thomas greeted him with a nervous eagerness that bordered on manic. Catherine remained upstairs, pleading a headache. Over dinner, Thomas spoke feverishly of Jordan, his restraint slipping away, his fascination laid bare in language too vivid for comfort. Carlyle's polite interest gradually turned to unease. "Finally," he said, "would very much like to examine this person, if you permit it." "That's why I asked you here," Thomas replied quickly. "I value your expertise, your assessment of the situation." The word lingered. After dinner, they climbed to the third floor. Catherine was there, pale and silent in her chair by the window. Jordan stood near the door, hands clasped, still as ever. "This is Jordan," Thomas said. Carlyle began his examination, methodical, professional, precise. He treated Jordan not as a specimen but as a human being, asking gentle questions, making careful notes. When he finally stepped back, his eyes softened. "Remarkable," he murmured, but beneath that word lay something deeper, pity, perhaps, or fear of the thing they had all helped create. A genuine case of hermaphroditism, quite rare indeed, the doctor said as he looked at Thomas and then at Catherine, who sat motionless in her chair, and asked to speak privately with Mr. Rutledge. They went to Thomas's study, leaving Catherine and Jordan alone upstairs. Carroll accepted a brandy and stood by the fire, choosing his words carefully. He told Thomas that he had known his family for many years, had respected his father despite his flaws, and therefore had to speak frankly now as a friend and a physician. Thomas felt a tightening dread in his stomach as Carroll explained that the slave upstairs was indeed a genuine hermaphrodite, a condition as rare as Thomas had suggested, and from a medical standpoint of great research interest. But the doctor's concern was not the condition itself, it was the atmosphere in the room, the tension, and the way Thomas and his wife looked at that person, as if something unhealthy was festering beneath their words. Thomas flushed and denied any improper implication, but Carroll pressed on, saying that he feared Thomas had become dangerously fixated on the slave in a way that went far beyond medical curiosity. He pointed out that the plantation was failing, Catherine looked exhausted and sleepless, and Thomas himself appeared consumed. This wasn't healthy, he warned, and whatever was happening needed to stop before it destroyed them both. Thomas's reply was sharp, insisting that Jordan was his property and he could manage his property as he saw fit, but Carroll reminded him that even in the treatment of slaves there were moral lines, and feared that Thomas had crossed several. The conversation deteriorated into defensiveness and anger. Carroll remained calm but firm, trying to make Thomas see the truth, yet the man could neither understand nor accept it. The obsession had sunk its hooks too deeply. The doctor left the next morning, troubled and convinced that something terrible was unfolding at Belmont Estate. He thought of writing to mutual friends or even the authorities but hesitated, for what could he report, that a man was too interested in a slave? It wasn't illegal, nor unusual in Virginia in 1851. So Carroll did nothing, and the chance to intervene slipped away. After his departure, Thomas and Catherine avoided speaking of the visit, but something inside them had shifted. The doctor's words had forced them to glimpse what they were becoming, and instead of changing, they sank deeper into their obsession, clinging to it as if total surrender might somehow absolve their guilt. January of 1852 brought heavy snow that isolated Belmont Estate for nearly 3 weeks, covering the tobacco fields in white silence while the slaves huddled in their quarters around smoky fires. Inside the main house, Thomas and Catherine spiraled further into a darkness they could no longer deny or escape. The isolation fed their descent, with no visitors or appearances to maintain, they abandoned the last traces of restraint. Thomas stopped pretending to manage the plantation, and Catherine ceased leaving the 3rd floor altogether. Jordan, caught between existence and survival, remained in that strange liminal space between person and object, living yet not living. But even in that stillness, something had changed in Jordan too. The slave began to speak more often, not with defiance, but with a quiet truth that unsettled Thomas and Catherine. Jordan realized that words could crack their certainty and infect their rationalizations with doubt. One evening, after Catherine left the room in tears from yet another argument, Jordan quietly told Thomas that they were hurting each other now, not just the slave, and that the obsession was eating them alive from within. Thomas, exhausted and broken, glared with hatred and asked what Jordan wanted, an admission of wrongdoing? He insisted that Jordan was property, existing only to serve. But Jordan calmly replied that it was Thomas and Catherine who were truly enslaved, bound to their desires and their need to possess something they could never have, while Jordan, forced to submit by law, still retained the freedom of the mind. The words cut deeper than any whip could. Thomas raised his hand to strike but stopped, realizing no punishment could restore the power dynamic already lost. He left the room silently, his authority shattered. February arrived with thawing winds but no relief. The enslaved people whispered among themselves, sensing that something terrible was building. Some began plotting escapes, desperate to flee before the storm broke. Harriet, the housemaid, refused to bring food to the third floor, forcing Catherine to fetch her own meals. 2 field hands were caught trying to run, but Thomas barely noticed, lost in his madness while the overseer quietly took charge of the plantation. Catherine was wasting away, pale and skeletal, sleeping in brief fits, haunting the halls like a restless ghost. Her friends sent unanswered letters, the minister was turned away at the door, and she spent every waking hour in Jordan's room or pacing endlessly. She confessed to Jordan one afternoon that she saw herself in them, neither fully alive nor fully dead, trapped in an impossible space between. Jordan replied gently that she was seeing only what she wanted to see, that they were merely a person, born different but still human, and that it was Thomas and Catherine who had turned them into a symbol of their own confusion and loss. Catherine trembled, admitting that perhaps they were all lost, but Jordan told her that she had chosen her path, unlike them. The household staff began to notice the mistress's decline. Dalia saw her in the hall and was horrified by her skeletal appearance, wild eyes, and unkempt hair. Thomas was no better, unkempt, muttering to himself, wandering the halls like a ghost. Servants learned to vanish when he appeared, fearing his unpredictable moods. Whispers grew darker, everyone felt the air tightening, the dread of an approaching catastrophe. They prepared quietly, hiding food, repairing shoes, speaking in whispers about freedom. Harriet, driven by fear and compassion, finally tried to intervene. She found Thomas in his study one afternoon, staring blankly into his whiskey glass, and gathered her courage to speak. She told him plainly that what he and the mistress were doing with Jordan wasn't right and was destroying them all, urging him to sell Jordan and end the madness. Thomas looked at her for a long time, and instead of anger, something broke inside him. He knew she was right but was powerless to change. His voice barely audible, he told her to leave. Harriet left, heart pounding, knowing she had failed. If this story chills you, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, like and subscribe to hear what happens next, for the horror at Belmont Estate was only beginning. The breaking point came on February 14, 1852. The day began like any other in that decaying house. Thomas rose late, hollow-eyed and disheveled. Catherine hadn't left the third floor in days, and Jordan went through the motions of survival. But something was different. Those who knew Catherine best sensed she had reached her breaking point. Her calmness that morning was terrifying, her eyes glassy and distant as if fixed on something invisible. When Dalia offered tea, Catherine only shook her head and continued upstairs. Harriet saw it too and prayed quietly that whatever was coming would spare the innocent. By evening, cold rain fell, turning the world outside into gray haze. The wind howled through the old house as if foretelling doom. Thomas sat by the fire in his study, drinking mechanically, numb to everything. Upstairs, Catherine sat in Jordan's room, her stare intense and desperate. The lamp flickered as thunder rolled, and she suddenly confessed that she could no longer bear this life or what they had become. Jordan urged her to leave, to start over somewhere far away, but she laughed bitterly, saying there was no starting over from such guilt, only ending it. When Jordan asked what she meant, Catherine began pacing, haunted and broken, saying she had once believed understanding Jordan would free her from emptiness, but it had only deepened her despair. She admitted that Jordan had been right, they were just a person, and Thomas, and she had turned them into a symbol of their own ruin. Now she couldn't live with what that made them. When Jordan addressed her by name, begging her to seek help, Catherine snapped, saying there was no help for monsters who had used another human being to fill their own emptiness. She moved to the dresser and drew out a dull gleam of metal, a pistol, one of Thomas's father's dueling guns. Jordan stood, hands raised, pleading, but Catherine said she was tired of being alive, tired of feeling everything and nothing. Thunder boomed, the lamp flickered, and in that moment her face looked skeletal and ghostly. The door burst open. Thomas stood there, dripping from the rain, eyes locking on the pistol. The fog of despair seemed to lift as he asked what she was doing. She told him she was ending it before they destroyed anyone else. He stepped closer, voice soft and pleading, telling her to put it down, but she laughed hollowly, saying there was no fixing what they'd done. She gestured at Jordan, saying they had destroyed everything they touched. Jordan spoke calmly, telling her she wasn't a monster, just a person who could still choose differently. But Catherine whispered that it was too late, that it had been too late since the day Thomas brought Jordan to Belmont, maybe even earlier, when she married for money, when she lost the baby, when she became someone she wasn't. Every breath now was agony, and she couldn't bear it any longer. Thomas begged her to think, but she screamed that she had thought of nothing else, that this was the only choice that was truly hers. Then her hands stilled, her face softened, and a strange peace settled over her. She apologized to Jordan for everything they had done, then turned the gun from Jordan to herself and pressed it under her chin. Thomas lunged, but too late. The gunshot cracked through the house like thunder. Catherine's body fell backward, blood pooling beneath her head like a dark halo. Thomas fell beside her, making sounds of raw, animal grief. Jordan stood still by the window, face unreadable, as rain fell and thunder rolled outside as if the world itself were indifferent. Downstairs, the servants froze. Harriet's worst fears were confirmed. Delia wept silently, and whispers filled the hallway as the enslaved debated whether to flee or stay. Catherine lived for 17 more hours, suspended between life and death, while Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering apologies she could no longer hear, begging forgiveness from someone already gone though her heart still beat faintly. Jordan brought water and clean cloths, tending to both master and dying mistress with quiet efficiency, saying nothing and offering no comfort or judgment, simply performing the tasks that needed to be done, existing within that familiar space of service that required neither thought nor feeling nor any engagement with the horror unfolding around him. Near midnight, the household doctor arrived, summoned by one of the servants, and after examining Catherine, he shook his head gravely and told Thomas there was nothing to be done but wait, as the damage was too severe, too deep within the brain, and it was a miracle she had survived as long as she had. When Thomas asked if she was suffering, the doctor assured him she was beyond all suffering now, feeling and aware of nothing, already more absent than present. Dismissing the doctor, Thomas returned to Catherine's bedside, maintaining his vigil through the long dark hours, speaking to her at times in rambling confessions of guilt, grief, and love, words he had never spoken while she could hear them. He poured out his emptiness and brokenness, admitting how he had thought she could fill the void within him, only to be devastated when he discovered she was just as hollow as he was. He apologized for bringing Jordan into their lives, for starting them down a path that could only end in ruin, and then he fell silent, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest as it grew weaker with every hour. When dawn's gray light began to seep through the rain-streaked windows, Catherine's breathing changed one final time, becoming labored and rattling, the sound of a body surrendering its last hold on life. Thomas leaned close, tears falling onto her pale face as he gripped her hand with desperate strength, whispering an apology for everything, for failing her, for it all. Her eyes opened briefly, clouded and distant, perhaps seeing him one last time or perhaps seeing nothing at all, and her lips moved to form silent words he would never know, messages that died unspoken. Then she was gone, the terrible rattling ceased, her hand went limp, and the faint warmth of her skin faded into the cold that claimed all the dead. Thomas sat beside her body for hours, unable to move or think, consumed by a vast emptiness that seemed to swallow everything, Catherine, himself, the entire world collapsing into a void without bottom or end. Finally, Jordan's quiet voice came from the doorway, reminding him that someone needed to be called, that the doctor and servants must be told. Thomas looked up, his face ravaged by grief and guilt, eyes red from tears, hands still clutching the cooling fingers of his dead wife, and in that moment, unable to bear the crushing weight of his own culpability, he lashed out at the only target available, accusing Jordan of causing all this, of destroying everything. Jordan met his gaze steadily, neither flinching nor arguing, merely responding that Thomas had done this to himself, that he had only been present. The words hung heavy between them, simple and devastating in their truth, and Thomas had no answer. The aftermath unfolded with grim inevitability, each event following logically from what had come before, like a mathematical proof leading to an inescapable conclusion. Thomas claimed Catherine's death had been an accident, a tragic misfortune caused by her mishandling one of his father's old pistols, unaware it was loaded, and the local magistrate, who had known Thomas since childhood and understood the complications a suicide would bring to a respectable family, accepted the story with visible relief. His brief investigation avoided difficult questions and arrived at the conclusion everyone preferred, because suicide was shameful, legally tangled, and problematic for both church and inheritance, whereas an accident was simpler for all. 3 days later, the funeral was held at Christ Church in Farmville, attended by neighboring planters and their wives who stood in the cold rain offering sympathetic condolences, remarking on how devastated Thomas appeared and how grief had hollowed him out until he seemed barely substantial. None of them knew the truth of what had transpired within Belmont's walls, and those who might have suspected wisely kept silent, for some questions were better left unasked in Virginia in 1852. But the enslaved community knew. They always knew. In the quarters of Belmont and neighboring plantations, whispered conversations carried the truth through the invisible network binding Virginia's enslaved population, and the story of what had happened spread and evolved, becoming legend, a warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the destruction born from treating people as objects of desire. They spoke of Jordan, the strange slave who was neither man nor woman, said to have driven the Rutledges to ruin simply by existing. Some claimed Jordan wielded conjure or hoodoo that turned masters mad, others whispered Jordan's beauty was so unearthly that even righteous souls succumbed to sin, and still others said Jordan had done nothing but reflect the Rutledges' own corruption back at them until they destroyed themselves in shame. The truth, as always, was less dramatic yet far more tragic, but the legend served its purpose. It reminded the enslaved that their masters were not invincible, that guilt and obsession could destroy even the powerful, and that sometimes, survival itself was victory. Within a week of the funeral, Thomas arranged to sell Belmont, accepting the first reasonable offer despite its low value, desperate to escape the sight of his ruin. Before finalizing the sale, he did 3 things. He ordered the third-floor room where Catherine had died to be sealed and locked, its furniture removed and the bloodstains scrubbed, though they never vanished, and the key thrown into the well, with written instructions that the room remain sealed forever. He then burned every document related to Jordan, bills of sale, medical notes, journals, and letters, watching them turn to ash along with Catherine's diary, which he could not bear to read, and finally, he sold most of the enslaved workers, scattering families and communities to different owners with the cold logic of liquidation, though a distant guilt lingered. Yet he kept Jordan, for reasons he could not explain, perhaps because Jordan alone understood what had happened, or because his fascination had never faded, or because he could not bear the idea of another man owning the one who had shared his ruin. Thomas moved to a small house in Lynchburg with Jordan and 2 elderly servants too frail to sell, withdrawing completely from society, living like a ghost among the living, venturing out only for necessities. He aged rapidly, his once proud bearing replaced by the stoop of a man crushed by invisible weight. Jordan lived quietly in a small upstairs room, still legally property yet no longer bound by the obsessive control that had defined Belmont. They spoke rarely, only to exchange formal words about household tasks. Their connection dissolved into a silence more haunting than intimacy. At night, Thomas would sometimes stand outside Jordan's door, hand trembling midair, wanting understanding, forgiveness, some acknowledgement that what they had shared had meant something, but he never knocked, and Jordan, awake and aware of his presence, never opened the door, offering neither comfort nor confrontation, for there was nothing left to say. The months passed slowly in that house of ghosts, Thomas fading further into himself, drinking lightly to dull memory until one morning in November 1852, 9 months after Catherine's death, he was found lifeless in bed. The doctor could find no disease or wound, only noted in his report that sometimes a man dies of a broken spirit as surely as from a broken bone. Jordan was sold at auction along with the rest of Thomas's estate, fetching only $412, as rumors of the Rutledge tragedy had made buyers wary. The new owner, a farmer from Appomattox County, dismissed the gossip as superstition, and after that, Jordan vanished from all records, absorbed into the faceless anonymity of bondage, one of countless lives lost to history. Perhaps Jordan escaped, found freedom and peace, or perhaps died young and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave. History gives no answer, and perhaps that silence is its own truth. Belmont stood empty for 3 years before the merchant who had bought it finally moved in, only for strange things to begin almost immediately. The sealed third-floor room exuded an unnatural chill, and those who passed it heard faint sounds within though it had been locked for years. Curiosity eventually overcame caution, and the room was opened against the original contract's warning. Inside, they found the floor stained dark where blood had soaked through, the air thick with an oppressive weight that drove the workers out within minutes. Though the room was stripped, the boards replaced and the walls repainted, the house never felt right again. One by one, new owners came and went, each unnerved by shadows that moved oddly and sounds that echoed where there should be none. Some dismissed it as old house superstition, others whispered that Belmont itself was cursed, doomed to consume all who tried to inhabit it. In 1865, during the chaos of the war's final months, the house burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Some blamed soldiers, others locals seeking to erase its dark history, but some whispered the house destroyed itself, the accumulated sorrow igniting from within. Only the foundations and outbuildings remained, slowly swallowed by forest and time, until nothing was left but crumbling bricks and whispers. Today, the land is private, marked with no trespassing signs that no one seems to maintain, its history absent from official records, as if someone long ago had worked carefully to erase it from memory, leaving only silence, and the sealed court documents that still bear the name Rutledge.